What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what's up? My name's Erica. Heya, how you doing? For today's episode, my guest truly needs no introduction. I'm speaking to the host of the world-famous podcast called Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, and that is the incredible Liv Albert. Now, Liv is not only a podcaster, she's also an author, and she's published 2 books, which I have here. The first of which is Greek Mythology, The Gods, Goddess, and Heroes Handbook. The second is actually a cocktail book, which is all themed around mythology type cocktails. They're really fun, they're really tasty, and that is called Nectar of the Gods. So I cannot recommend either of these books enough, which just shows that Liv is a jack of all trades at this point. Now, Liv and I have actually been friends for about 2.5 years, both online and in person. We did hang out last year in Greece quite a bit because we were both there around the same time. I was there for a month and Liv was there for just over a month, maybe 2 months-ish, but regardless. And so we hung out a lot. We went to museums. We spent many a night drinking on Athenian rooftops. We also just went for walks. We just had a really wonderful time. So we've been wanting to do this collaboration for quite a while. Honestly, we've been talking about it since before we met in Greece, both me going on her podcast and her coming on here. And finally, we found a really good topic to talk about. Now, I cannot guarantee that today we're going to stick to the topic because it is me and Liv and we tend to go off on tangents. So the intention is to discuss the Iliad and the Odyssey primarily, and it is really to sort of figure out the strengths, the weaknesses, which may be better. I don't think we'll come to a conclusion because they're such different books. But it's really spurred on because you guys keep asking me to do one of these comparison videos between the 2 texts, and I just thought that why wouldn't I bring on a Greek mythology expert and my wonderful friend to come on and do this with me. So you guys know that I am Team Iliad, and Liv, you are Team Odyssey though, aren't you?
I am the Odyssey forever. The Odyssey is my favorite ancient text. Odysseus is my problematic fave. I recognize that he is not a good guy, and yet I would marry him. I am all about the Odyssey. I enjoy the Iliad, do not get me wrong, but I'm not here for the war in the same way. I just want that adventure and monsters and witches and the Odyssey.
Do you think then that the Iliad is too clouded by the war? Because I am Team Iliad, my audience know that. So I'm curious from somebody who isn't Team Iliad, what's the issue with the war?
There's not an issue with the war. I'm just less interested. So I love the Iliad. I've read it a handful of times. I fully enjoy it. I think it has all of the merits and value on its own. It's just that if I have to pick between them, I prefer the Odyssey. And it might not even be so much the war as it is I just really enjoy Odysseus. And I enjoy the monsters. My love of mythology is also based a lot in the weird of mythology, the monsters and all of the cannibalism, Cyclops. I like how clever Odysseus is. It just feels like more of an adventure that I want to read. So I just like it more, but I do love the Iliad, don't get me wrong.
So is it Odysseus then that just draws you in?
Yeah. Odysseus is the best. I love him so much. It's stupid, even though he's a dangerous guy. He's not a good dude. And yet, I dedicated my book to him, and I will love him forever.
I love how you dedicated your book to him.
I am completely incapable of being serious about serious things. I think it was also surreal that I was given a book deal and I had a month to write the book and it was in the height of the pandemic. And I also had to start reopening a retail store in the middle of the pandemic and write a whole book. And so it was all so stressful and surreal that I was completely incapable of being sincere. And I'm really generally incapable of being sincere anyway. I have to make everything a joke. So I'm dedicate this book to my family and friends? No, I'm going to dedicate this book to Odysseus.
Literally, your poor family, your sister opening the book and being oh, okay.
They're not even in the acknowledgments. I had so much trouble. Just any kind of sincerity. I don't know. I'm I deeply broken person emotionally, and so I can't be sincere about anything. I just have to talk about Odysseus.
So is Odysseus your favorite character of the Odyssey, or is he just a favorite character in general?
Like, as a person who has built a career on feminist parts of myths, I feel like I should say that probably my favorite character overall is Medusa. But Odysseus is a close second, and he is absolutely my favorite male character. Yes. Well, for different reasons, but in terms of like for ancient texts and like the content that we have, yeah, Odysseus is my favorite. I only say that because like Cadmus also has to be my favorite because I love him deeply, but there's like nothing to read about him, so he doesn't count in the same way, you know?
Yeah, at least Odysseus gets a whole book.
Yeah, Odysseus, there's so much going on. There's so much complexity. He's a complicated man, as Emily Wilson translates for us.
Do you think he's more complex than Achilles? This is where I'm going to start arguing with you because I'm ready to like bare my teeth.
Yeah, I do. I think I could argue that. Yeah.
How? How could he be more complex than Achilles?
Because he is like Achilles, I think, is too bratty to be considered all that complex. He is complex, but he is at his heart a spoiled brat. And I feel like I'm breaking you right now. Whereas Odysseus is a brat in a lot of ways. I don't think that I would consider him a spoiled brat in the way that Achilles is. He does not have a goddess mother to run crying to when things do not go his way. He is both caring and compassionate and murderous as fuck. He is a guy who loves, I would say, a bit too deeply for Penelope's sake. Mayhaps he could love a few less women. He is, he has a lot going on. He both wants to save his men and will let them all die when necessary. I think that there's so much more to him. Sing muse of a complicated man. That's all we need.
See, okay. I agree that Achilles is bratty. I do. And I think that when you read it, like, when you just read the narrative and you don't look into anything, he is so hard to get behind because he is such a brat. And you're like, how could you go to your mum to have her ask Zeus to murder your whole army to prove a point? Like, that is literally toddler behavior. But to his credit for that, he's only a toddler in those moments because he is half god and the gods are toddlers. So and I'm like, with great power comes great responsibility.
And he does not utilize his responsibility whatsoever. He would fail all of that Spider-Man quote. I like that you even use that quote because it's so not applicable to Achilles.
It so is. I am literally.
No part of him ever takes that responsibility. He is like, with great power comes great responsibility, and I don't want it, and I won't take it, and I'm going to tell my mom if you try to make me.
But then he does. But then at the end, when he does take the responsibility, hello, after book 18.
He only takes any kind of responsibility once Patroclus dies. He needs to have, like, this horrible thing happen to him for him to realize that, like, maybe he should be slightly less bratty. That does not mean he takes responsibility. He just, like, has trauma and reacts to that trauma.
He does, but also okay. You guys are going to see a different side of me because I get into like Achilles' psyche so much because I'm like, I love him to pieces. I really do have a soft spot for him. And he is so bratty because he is constantly in between two like polar opposites. Like he's in between mortal and god. So he's not quite powerful enough to be taken seriously as a god, but yet he's too powerful for the mortals. And yet still a lot of the mortals are more powerful than him. So Agamemnon, for example, is above him. So he's so bratty because he doesn't have any leeway in any space where the mortals are like, oh, you're so great. And the gods are like, stay in your spot. Multiple times Apollo is like, don't do that, Achilles. You're not a god. And he's like, but I want to. Like proper whinging about it. Because he can't. And so when he has that space to finally be whingy and he's allowed to be whingy, he takes it.
So I'm going to counter this with a single word, and that word is Heracles.
But Heracles had a really terrible deed that he had to overcome.
Yeah.
Achilles didn't.
Well, but Heracles wasn't a whiny little bitch before his deed needed to be done. Also, and I'm going to counter this, and I have to preface with, it's important to state that I'm saying all of this based entirely on Greek sources, because that's what I care about in this world. But do you know there is another half mortal, half god hanging out during that war and not making it all about him and not being a whiny little bitch?
Who, Sarpedon?
Aeneas.
Oh, he's about to make it all about him. Hold on.
But that is why I said we're talking about Greek sources, because the Roman just take all that shit and they're like, we're going to make Aeneas into Achilles/Odysseus anyway, so it doesn't even count because it's just fan fiction. But if you take away the fan fiction that is the Aeneid, Romanists don't come for me. It's true. Then Aeneas in the Iliad is a fascinating character who has all of the same general attributes as Achilles. On paper, in the Iliad, Aeneas and Achilles are the same fucking person, and yet they behave in completely different ways. And I do have this like deep obsession with wondering what the Greeks had in mind for Aeneas because of all of this, because everything about the Iliad like raises him up to be this big ass character, and then like obviously Rome took it and ran with it, but like what if they hadn't? Like what was the Greek side of it? And anyway, I often forget how much I'm obsessed with fucking Aeneas, and clearly you are too.
No, okay, so literally talking about that, there's that one line, I'm pretty sure I messaged you this like a year ago, and you were like, guys, I want to know things about... Literally, you were like, guys, I want to know things about Aeneas, and I was like, great, can you find out the answer? Because in book 20 of the Iliad, like Poseidon's like, oh, we've got to save him from this fight with Achilles because he's going to go on to like continue the Trojan race. And obviously that book is written down in like 750 BC, right? So this myth is super duper old.
Before the Aeneid.
Way before also Rome. Like Rome was established.
Yeah, but the Aeneid of it all was not established at all.
It was
Remus back then.
But even then, like that, it wasn't a real famous city then. It was just like, great, that was establishment year of what was it, 750? Yeah, it was 750 or 756, something like that. Oh goodness, off the top of my head, whatever it was.
Yeah, Aeneas didn't. Yeah, I don't know what a Roman's fine, but Aeneas didn't come in until like 400 years later or something, like if not more. Like Aeneas was not a part of their original founding mythos. He was like retconned in later, and so yeah, like, and he's retconned in because they found him in the Iliad, and they were like, look at this, it's like literally written for us. It's literally written as if somebody's gonna go found Rome, so let's make him. But the Greeks did not have that in mind. So yeah, like what was he? He is the son of Aphrodite. He's her only half-mortal child. Like she famously was with Anchises in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. So it's also like there's this enormous lead up to who Aeneas is, and then he just drops off the map. And I desperately like want to know what the Greeks had in mind for this character. I just feel like he's completely unfinished in a way that like no other character is.
I could not agree more. And also the Aeneid literally takes his character and spins it so differently to the Iliad. So I'm like, well, that wasn't him.
The Aeneid doesn't count, exactly.
It doesn't count.
Again, Romanists don't come for me. But like, it doesn't count if you are examining this idea of Greek Aeneas, which is what I'm interested in, because you can't then look at Roman Aeneas and put the two together. It just doesn't work, because it's not how, it would have actually been in the ancient world. And so yeah. Anyway, I clearly made this whole conversation about Greek Aeneas because I'm obsessed with him.
That's fine, because you then also prove my point that the Iliad is probably better because Aeneas is in it, because he's not in the Odyssey.
Better. It's just a part of the Iliad that I'm particularly fascinated by. And like I said, I like the Iliad. I'm not saying I don't like the Iliad. I love it. But the Odyssey, there's just so much. Now, I do have to say, I hate all the Telemachus bits. So not interested in that.
So who's your favorite woman from the Odyssey?
Circe.
So why?
One, I think Circe existing is another point in the Odyssey versus Iliad in the favor of that. But also, that brings up a really important point that is absolutely in the Odyssey's favor, and I think makes it a real standout comparatively to the Iliad. And that is that there are women in it. There are women that are not gods or Briseis or Helen, but like There are so few women in the Iliad. Like, sure, Andromache like exists, Hecuba exists, but they are not featured in any kind of substantive way. But in the Odyssey, we have Penelope. Obviously, like everyone's understanding of Penelope has so many issues. I get it. Like, I'm not going to say that she is like this perfect woman. She is fascinating, though. And you have Calypso. So you get this woman who's like actually a villain. Like, she does not get enough shit for how awful her the whole time is.
Couldn't agree more.
And I think, right? Like, but so we have like a woman who's bad too. And then we have Circe who is like right in the middle. Like, Penelope's good. Calypso's bad. Circe's sitting in the middle being like, I don't really give a fuck what anyone thinks of me. I'm going to turn you into a pig if I want you to. I'm going to fuck that guy because he's hot and he's here and he wants to. And here we all are. And then we have Persephone is in the Odyssey. There's a whole ass Catabasis, which is hugely in its favor. We have a whole delving into the underworld. We've got gods drinking blood. Or I guess not gods, we've got dead people drinking blood. We've got heroes. We've got talk of Achilles and Patroclus after the fact. How nice is that? We've got Agamemnon shitting all over Clytemnestra. Love that bit. She is absolutely the best, and I love to hear how mad he is that she killed him. The Odyssey just has so many good things in it. Helen is there, and Helen is so fascinating in the Odyssey. She is so weird and interesting, and like a completely different Helen from the Iliad, which is so interesting in itself. I mean, I think I love the theory that like the Iliad and the Odyssey were not remotely written by the same person, and I think it's so valid. They're completely different books. The narrative structure is completely different. The characters are completely different, even when they do cross over.
I would argue about the women thing, though. Only because. So there are female characters that we have mentioned, obviously, in the Iliad. There are not as many as in the Odyssey. But...
And they do not get as many lines or things to say or personalities.
True, but something that we don't take into consideration about the Iliad is that a lot of it is based on the Lamentations song, and that's an inherently female thing, which undercuts the entire poem. So a lot of the poem is sung in a way that women would have sung it, which I think is not...
like a man's way of saying that actually there are women in the Iliad.
It's not. It's a very valid point. There are lots of Lamentations, and I always use that.
No, that's a stretch. That's you really forcing it.
That's me loving the Iliad and seeing it.
Like, you're not wrong. I agree completely. That's absolutely a valid take, but it doesn't actually like support the idea of it being more like about women than the Odyssey.
And also it is set in war, so we can't have so many women. That's also my point.
But there are women in it, and they could feature in more. There could be more Helen, there could be more Andromache, there could be more Hecuba.
I mean, there could be potentially, I see your point, but the moments that they're in are so powerful despite being so minimal. All we need to see is Helen yelling at Paris twice to know, okay, she really doesn't want to be there. Like, we don't need any more times of that. When we have Andromache...
We could and should be more Helen in the Iliad.
I agree there should be more, but at the same time there doesn't have to be because we get enough of her that we see her character.
Mm-hmm.
You're like so not buying this.
The Odyssey is better. What can I tell you?
But also, like, the gods in the Iliad are just so entertaining, and the female gods in the Iliad are so entertaining that we don't get that in the Odyssey.
Yeah, which is just another fascinating aspect of it being, I think, just a completely different author. Or, you know, obviously there's no authorship necessarily anyways, oral storytelling, but like that there is like this enormous difference between those two books, I think is so interesting and valid, because you're right. Like, suddenly we go from this one that's like the gods are so heavily featured in this really interesting way, and absolutely love the gods. And they're like, I think the Iliad is such a great example of the gods just being at their true like godliness, in that the Greeks literally thought that they were petty assholes, just like fucking with shit all of the time. And I love that that comes across, like, not only in mythology broadly, but in their like most famous epic. It's just wonderful.
Yeah, and like I feel like we don't get enough of those, like, because I read them back to back, which like I hadn't done in so long. But like reading them back to back, I didn't realize like how fun the Iliad was with the gods and how ridiculous they are in that, and then going from that to the Odyssey, where we have different characters being ridiculous, which is mostly Odysseus, and you're like, what are you doing? Why would you do this? Like, this doesn't make any logical sense. So we just kind of switch.
I adjusted my camera because my microphone is hiding it, so I'm going to adjust this too. But I think it should be shown my collection because all of these are the Odyssey.
Oh my lord.
And then there's some over here as well. I have the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I do think I have like 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 like full editions of the Odyssey, and then adaptations there's like probably another 5 in there.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm simply very proud of that. And Homer sits right in the middle looking beautiful.
Oh, is that the bust?
Yeah.
Stop. I love seeing busts of Homer. That's like the funniest thing to me.
I know, because it's like who's this guy?
Like, was this like Dom just sitting down for a little bit of carving one day? They were like, you're Homer now.
Yeah, I guess that's you.
So then what's the best episode in the Odyssey?
Ooh, the underworld.
Really? Why?
Yeah. I love it. It's just fascinating. I love that we get this insight into like how one might commune with the dead. I like that he doesn't technically go to the underworld. He goes to like the other side and he has to like kind of call them over. We get these beautiful ways of like sometimes they can't speak to him until he's done the certain thing. And it's really interesting because you get extra insights into the people who died in the war and afterwards, right? You get Achilles and I guess Patroclus isn't there, but he's like mentioned, I think. And it's also been a while since I read the Odyssey. I'm sorry. But then like an Agamemnon, and I love that we get this like with this knowledge through that moment that Clytemnestra did kill him. And I love that because otherwise we only have it surviving in the plays, but we have this like proof. I guess Menelaus probably mentions it also when Telemachus is in Sparta, which is the only redeeming part of Telemachus, is that we wouldn't have the Menelaus and Helen without Telemachus. So like whatever. But I have an episode one like in my Odyssey episodes from ages ago now, and I think one of the first ones is just called Telemachus is a whiny little bitch.
See, but I do love like how the Clytemnestra and Agamemnon story is told literally like 8 times throughout that book, because he constantly is like even
Telemachus about it.
And Agamemnon's like, did you hear? Not like my wife, and like
every killed me.
Like everyone's like talking about it, and I'm just like, this is the funniest thing, that it's like the hot gossip of the Odyssey. Everyone's like, did you hear that story? How wild was that?
Because it's also like it's really interesting that it is told so much, because it's really embarrassing for Agamemnon. Like, it does not make him look good. He looks like an absolute loser. And yet still everyone is like, did you hear his wife killed him? Like, that's pretty hardcore.
But also he brings it up.
He does. And but it's all about like how Penelope is so good because she didn't murder him.
Yeah, well done. You chose well. Your wife's not a murderer.
I love it. It's like, oh, it's so silly. I really just, I just think the Iliad or the Odyssey like also has so many weird moments like that. I guess I like it just because it has lighter moments amidst all the dark. And while the Iliad has bits and pieces of that, it doesn't have it to the same degree of the Odyssey, you know? And I love the monsters. I think is a huge part of what drew me to it, at least initially. Like, I know I fell in love with the Odyssey in my undergrad and like never looked back. But like Scylla and Charybdis just existing fills me with such joy. And just kind of, I don't know, everything about it. The Lacedaemonians, or no, that's Sparta. What I'm talking about, the Lystragonians.
It's because you just did your Sparta series as well.
Yeah, exactly. My brain is Lacedaemonia. But no, like the Lystragonians are so weird. I like that they're never mentioned in another myth, as far as I know. And the Phaeacians are rarely mentioned anywhere else, but they play this huge role. Like, I think the Odyssey gives us this fascinating insight into the region at the time, what they thought about traveling on the sea, like all these different things that it just to me provides. I guess it just provides insight into the things that I'm interested in, which is the broader mythology, the broader world that all of these things existed in. Whereas the Iliad is amazing and fascinating, but much more limited in its scope. Whereas I want to know everything about everything. And I just think the Odyssey gives more of that.
Okay, I'm curious. When was the first time you read The Odyssey?
I don't think I read any epic until I was in undergrad because I really I just had a thing for Greek mythology when I was younger, and we did not in high school, other than reading or learning some general ancient Greek history, probably we did not have to read anything like that. Like we did Shakespeare and stuff for that type of classics thing, but and I mean classics, not ancient classics. But yeah, we just never had to really touch upon any of that. And so I went to university did an English degree because I wanted to work in publishing. But I had started writing my novel about Cadmus and Harmonia. That's how long I've been writing this thing that's not finished. I started writing it, and I actually went to university because I had written this novel, and it taught me that maybe I wanted to work in publishing because it all just seemed so interesting. And so I wasn't even planning on university. I didn't go until I was 21. And so I was like, well, I'll just minor in classics because I've started writing this novel about these mythological characters that I just discovered on a whim, and I'd sort of just started reading things on my own. So I even just university for classics was sort of just for fun for a while, and then I did a double major because I was like, I'm not gonna do any electives that aren't classics. Why not just get a double major? And so yeah, I think I didn't have to read it until I know we did one course. I think I had to read it twice in university though, but I did one course that the book still looks like this.
I love that though.
Yeah, I clearly had a lot of thoughts and feelings on it at the time. But the real embarrassing thing is if you ask me when was the first time I read the Iliad.
Oh no, when was it?
It was for this podcast.
Was it?
Yeah, I had never read the Iliad, and so I read it to do for the show. Which also probably means that I've actually only read it twice, which is kind of embarrassing.
Not embarrassing. You read it twice more than a lot of people.
Well, sure, but I am an expert in Greek mythology, so maybe I should read it again. Yeah, I mean, I want to read it again now. What's your favorite translation?
Oh, it depends. So for prose, I like the Martin Hammond one, which is very not famous. Very not famous. It's 9:30, guys, by the way, when we're recording this. UK time. It's way past my bedtime. But yeah, so Martin Hammond, my favorite one, because it's so readable. It's just written like a storybook. But for poetry, it's definitely Lattimore, because I find that he gets the best with the Greek. He really understands all those intricacies and translates it the best, in my opinion. And I have loads of translations, some that I just don't think are good. Peter Green is really dull. I'm so sorry. I know that he's alive. If anybody knows him who's watching this,
it's nothing personal.
I've read his Argonautica. It's good.
Oh, really? Well, that's good. Okay, so we have a note. I'll put that in the description, guys. So, what is in your least favorite episode in either of the epics? Do you have a least favorite episode where every time you get to it, you're like, oh God, not Telemachus, before you jump on that?
Yeah, I was like, well, as long as Telemachus is not talking with Helen and Menelaus, then I fucking hate all of those parts. But once he gets to Ithaca, it doesn't thrill me quite as much. He's a real piece of shit. Once he gets to Ithaca, the level of lying that Odysseus can do, but at the same time, you know what? No, I find it fascinating. His level of lying is so dark. It's physically the idea that anyway, and now I'm going to just start talking about how great it is, so I won't. But I mean, the end bits where he's killing all of the women for doing absolutely nothing wrong, maybe that's my least favorite. I don't know, it's just Telemachus is the real answer.
I have a hot take on the women. I hated Melantho, so I was like, she's good to go. Like, that one I was fine with, because there's one woman called Melantha who does nothing but yell at him when he comes back as a beggar, and I'm like, she can go. That's fine.
I forgot that was her name. I was thinking that Melantha was a man in it. But yeah, no, you're right. Some of them are really rude. But at the same time, if you think like, but they're also enslaved and like.
Agreed. As a whole, as like a unit, I totally agree with that take, but I always then immediately think of Melantha, because I'm like, I really hated her the whole time. Like, you didn't have to open your mouth in those moments. Like, nothing was forcing you to, as opposed to like you were being forced to sleep with these men, and like, that's different. But you didn't have to say anything. You chose to. I'm like, shut up.
Not wrong. The Iliad, what would be my, I don't know. I don't remember. It's been too long since I've read it. I want to say the catalog of ships, just purely because I had to read that out loud on the podcast, and that was like, why am I doing this? Because I read out like audiobook style the whole Samuel Butler translation, and that was fascinating and frustrating and a real test about my ability to pronounce things, which I did quite poorly for a while. But
I don't think I could do that though. Like, that's a very difficult thing to do.
well, I also just like, I don't prepare for things. I physically can't. And so I read it for the first time, or that translation for the first time while recording. Like, I didn't like read anything ahead of time. I was like, well, we're just doing this and we'll figure it out as we go. So then specifically getting the catalog of ships was like,
there are so many names.
so many names, so many things to pronounce. What am I thinking?
See, I know that people dislike the catalog of ships, and I have to say reading it is really boring, but I really like really odd moments in stories in general, and that to me is such a weird moment. So I sat down and I did lots of maths to figure out how many people were on the Greek side during the Trojan War, because I was like, well, I know lots of other people have done it. Let's see what my numbers were. So I have a very intimate relationship with the catalog of ships, where I've tried to figure out, like, how many people were on each boat? How many people were in this army?
Well, I also think too, like, as much as, yeah, it's boring to read that way, to just like read straight, but it is really interesting once you're like aware of the regions and actually interested in looking at like who is coming from where and what their names are and who's was their father and stuff. Like, once you're deep enough into the nerdery that is, you know, Homeric mythology specifically, yeah, then it is completely fascinating in itself, if not maybe to read out loud.
But yeah, definitely there are lots of things. I think about both the Odyssey and the Iliad, that if you're not really deep into Homeric poetry, it all comes across as very boring and very unnecessary, which I always have to acknowledge, like, when I'm doing videos on my channel of like, okay, do they really need to know this? Probably not. This is the boring part. So I'm just going to say, leave it out. Just cut to this part instead.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. It's like, I think that's why I didn't read it for so long, because until I was as deep into my love of mythology as I am now, I would try. Like, it's not like I didn't try to read it, but I also didn't know what translation to get. Like, this is a thing I try to help people with on my show a lot too, and I know you do also, is like, people will try to pick up a translation and they'll just think, because nobody thinks about translations, I guess is what I really mean. So they'll just pick up a copy of the Iliad and be like, great, I'm going to just read the Iliad. Like, so often they'll pick up like a cheap one at a store, right? And so often those are really old and really inaccessible translations. So I think for me, like, the first time I ever looked at reading it, I can picture it now that I'm thinking about it this way. But I picked up some translation. I don't know whose it would have been, but I remember opening it, and it's one of those ones that doesn't Latinize the spelling. And if you're trying to read something that's an old and stuffy translation and they're not Latinizing the spelling, oh my God, that is so difficult. And I think I remember seeing like Achilles, you know, with the K and all of it, and being like, I don't know what, like, and you know, otherwise all I'd seen was Troy, and suddenly you're looking at these names and you're not even like recognizing them from Troy, and so you don't even have that to like hold on to. So I think a lot of people, and myself included at the beginning, like, we're completely turned off from trying to read an epic once that's the translation that you find. And so often it's like you're picking the cheap one. Like, I'm sure I got that one at a used store, and so it's just like the one that I found and I was like, this is not readable. So it is so hard until you know to look for the right translation, to know that you just have to spend more or get it from the library. Get a good translation, otherwise you're going to hate yourself and you're probably not going to read it, or you're going to hate it when there's no reason for you to hate it and you might have loved it if you had a good translation. And yeah, I mean, that part is so interesting in itself.
Well, I think also something that plays into that as well is that people have the idea of these characters in their head already, you know, whether it be Achilles or Odysseus or whatever, you know, like they've read a kid's book or they've watched Troy, heaven forbid, you know, or like...
No, I mean, heaven forbid, except for Sean Bean.
He was actually very good, I have to admit. He was fantastic.
Perfect.
He was a very good Odysseus, but people certainly have an idea in their head. And then I find, like, especially when I encounter people that have never read these things, and then they go to them, they're like, oh my God, I didn't expect that this character was going to be this way, or I didn't expect the action to play out this way, or who is this person? You know, so there's like the expectation that then unravels as soon as you read Homer as well, which I've realized, and I didn't know this before, was quite off-putting for a lot of people as well.
Yeah, I mean, if all you know of Achilles is, you know, the big hero with the ankle and like the things that you know, if you're not deep in this realm, then yeah, or like specifically if your access point is Troy, it's baffling because it's so different. And Brad Pitt is much less of a whiny little bitch than Achilles is in the actual book. Like, it's interesting. Certainly, I know I saw Troy multiple times before I ever read them, and so I can't remember how much that would have influenced me. Probably not that much by the time I got to the Iliad, because by the time I got to the Iliad, I was like had been doing this podcast for like 6 to 8 months and was pretty deep. And I went into all the earlier, you know, the things that happened to lead up to the Trojan War too. So you already kind of have that grounding before getting into the actual Iliad itself. But I remember really specifically, and I think it's even in the episodes on those, is like I always assumed, and I think probably everyone who's not in this realm would assume, that the Trojan horse is in the Iliad. And I absolutely love that it's not. Like, that everything famous about the Trojan War is not actually surviving in a Greek source. That in itself is fascinating and weird and cool.
What do you think of the mythology that Paris kills Achilles?
Where does that, I mean, does that come probably from, it's all from, what's his name? Quintus Smyrnaeus, I imagine.
It's the Ethiopias.
Oh, it's in the Ethiopias.
I think is the one that is called, the one that begins with A. I think you say it Ethiopias though, no?
It's Ethiopias, yeah. But the Ethiopias is only fragmentary, right? Does it
Yeah.
survive in fragments?
No, like 2 or 3 lines.
Yeah, okay. Because I know like most of like the horse and everything tends to come from the fall of Troy, the Roman guy, the Quintus Smyrnaeus.
It might also be in there, but I know it's definitely in that the Lost Greeks.
Also.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure it's also in that, but that tends to be the only way we have details on the Lost Greek sources, is because that guy wrote things down. But yeah, I mean, that I think I've always had that in my head, but probably from Troy and just kind of like, you know, not thinking about it too hard. I mean, I think that it's both interesting because it's so unexpected, but it's also like, what an enormous bummer for Achilles. The idea that he could be taken down by someone as dweeby as Paris. If I said that Achilles was a whiny little bitch, like, Paris is so much worse. I mean, he's just different. I guess he's worse just because he doesn't have any of like the redeeming stuff that makes Achilles so interesting.
Nothing.
Like, there's nothing that makes Paris interesting at all. Yeah. So I mean, it's a real blow to Achilles and his impressive nature.
He's also just very physically weak, which is something that always shocks me, that like the only time he hits someone is Diomedes, and he hits him in the foot. I cannot remember what book that's in, guys. I'm very sorry. But he hits him in the foot, and it's a total accident. And when it hits Diomedes in the foot, he's like, are you fucking joking? And he pulls this thing out and he waves it at Paris and is like, if you were a real man, you would have come down here with your sword instead of shooting me with this stupid arrow. And Paris is shook that he hit his mark. He was like, look at how great I am, even though it was an accident. Like, he didn't think he was going to do it. And he only hit him in the foot. It's like...
So, okay, that just the question about Paris and Achilles leads me to, what are your thoughts on the wildly niche idea that Helen never went to Troy at all.
I actually love that idea. I'm not gonna lie.
So do I.
I think it works way better for what I at least think the Iliad is about, which is it's not about Helen, it's about humanity and like this idea of like what it means to be a man and like pushing these stupid borders for pride and honor and chaos and whatever. It has nothing to do with her. So the fact that she's not there, I think makes that so clear.
And just even the way you phrase that reminds me how much I do love the Iliad for the fact that it does not suggest one side is better than the other. And I think that is so interesting. Like, if you were to pull morality and pick a side from the Iliad, I think you would pick Troy. I certainly would. And I think that the text almost wants you to pick Troy in a way that is amazing because it's literally written by the other side. And yet it is so sympathetic towards Troy. It is so like it really does make clear how shitty the Greeks are for doing what they're doing, how it's all so pointless. Like, it is such an anti-war narrative that I think, particularly in our generation, like, and being a millennial, an old millennial who's like fully cognizant of all of America's wars in the Middle East and just like the America of it all generally, I think that the Iliad being like the earliest surviving epic about war and being so anti-war is so wonderfully interesting and does add so much to it as a work of art, you know, like it's wonderful.
I literally couldn't agree with that more though. And it's something that I say so much on my channel because a lot of comments will come in being like, oh, well, I don't agree with war and I don't want to read the Iliad, but like your narration of it like really helped. And that really
bothers me. Doesn't agree with war.
Exactly, because the narrative, as you're saying, is so sympathetic towards the Trojans. And the idea is that everybody, like every man involved gets a backstory, they get a family, you get to hear where they're from, like who they're leaving behind. Like all of that is so important to the narrative that every kill on the Greek side, as well as, you know, the other way as well. But just talking specifically about the Trojans, every kill is highlighted, it is made human. And that is such a beautiful thing for a poem to do, that you really get both sides of this narrative. And you really, as you said, like you end up really siding with the Trojans, especially when you see what the gods are doing. You kind of want to be on the side of the Trojans, to be like, you guys were really good in war. The gods are really standing up for you. Zeus is even having a tough time turning his back on you guys. Like, it's heartbreaking.
That's the other thing too, the fact that the gods split between them are on both sides, I think is also really interesting. Like, yeah, I mean the I was gonna say the complexity, but I feel like you're gonna use that against my Odyssey. But the complexity of the Iliad is wonderful. And I think that, yeah, I wouldn't say that like the Odyssey has more complexity. I would say just Odysseus versus Achilles. But the Iliad itself, like, yeah, this whole conversation just makes me want to reread it. But it also makes me want to reread the Odyssey. So don't get too excited.
Well, I do agree that the Odyssey storyline is very complex, though. It is, because the idea of, like, what does it mean to come home is such an interesting question to pose for a whole narrative of, like, when are you truly home? Like, when is that point? Like, even when you get to Ithaca, he's not home. And then when he murders all of the men, okay, well, he's still not home then because he has to go to his dad. And it's still just like, okay, at what point is this man going to feel like he's home? That is very complex. So I agree with you on that.
But the Iliad, I mean, it is also perfect. Like, the thing that I'll never get over is just how are these ancient as all hell texts so wonderfully perfect to us today. Like, they're just so interesting in ways that like other epics aren't. And I think that's just proof of like nobody, you know, even in the ancient world, people wrote bad things too, or boring things or whatever. But the fact that the Iliad and the Odyssey are both in their own really unique ways, just so compelling and beautiful to read even now, is such a lovely idea and just lends itself to what I built my career on, which is that the ancient Greeks were amazing and wonderful and I love them desperately.
And also I think that those two texts, they just age with us as well. Like every generation gets something different from them. You're like, especially now, like we're going through a moment of being like, okay, well, let's look at all these really interesting women from Greek myth. And the Odyssey does offer so many of those. Helen as well from the Iliad. Hello. She's amazing in the Iliad.
The Helen in the Odyssey is considerably more interesting.
She's also very interesting for drugging her husband. But in the Iliad, she yells at Paris, and I love it.
I love in the Odyssey because like you get to think about Helen and her relationship afterwards. Like the fact that she and Menelaus just head home and it's like nothing ever happened. Like at no point in the Odyssey is any blame put on her. It's just like they're married. They're just living happily. Like this is just how it is. And she is strong and she is there to speak like with the men, and like you said, she drugs her husband, and like the Helen of the Odyssey is always, I always forget how interesting she is, and then I revisit it and she's just fascinating and just so incredibly different from the Iliad. And not to say that she isn't, do love that she yells at Paris in the Iliad, don't get me wrong, but like the two characters might as well be different people from the way they are portrayed. Their personalities are portrayed between the two pieces, and that in itself is like just makes me want to think of everything about it all the time.
Well, that's also the argument for like Homer as well, as we were saying, like Homer being two different writers for each epic, just because the characters are so different, but also the female characters in the Odyssey are very strong and very interesting. So it's like, how can you write such in-depth, incredible women and such incredible men? Like the Iliad is filled with incredible men. So how do you do both of those so well if you're just one person?
Well, and I mean, obviously, even the idea of it being two people is absurd. Like it is, I love the oral storytelling of it all. The idea that these two works were told by like possibly hundreds of people in all these different regions, and it all just changed and spread around, and we only happened to have this one final version of it that got preserved in Athens. So maybe they also like tacked on all this Athenian pride, and that is really interesting. And there's just so many incredible things to think about on that front. Like the idea of it being so many people who put these works together makes it, I mean, it makes them all so much more interesting. And the epics were already fascinating and complex and brilliant. And then you think about the idea that it was countless people putting these together in their own unique ways is like, oh my, it just makes me want to cry. It's so exciting and wonderful.
Picking up on something you said there, something I've always thought is like, okay, what if there were multiple written versions of, differently titled, but the Iliad and the Odyssey, and people really hated Homer's like back in the day, for all we know, and we've just lost all of this like critique that people are like, this is the worst thing we've ever read, you got to read this, guys, like this is way better, and yet that's the one that we have. I wonder if the ancients were like, you guys are reading the worst rendition of this story, or if they're like, no, this is the best.
Yeah, like, oh, this one's the one with all the Athenian propaganda, you want the one from Sparta or whatever, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I think about that with all of the ancient sources. Like the thing that I will never get over and try to bring up as many times as humanly possible is the alphabet plays of Euripides. Like this idea that we have a handful of plays that were not considered the best, that might have been considered some of his worst, but we have them in a way that we don't have anybody else's worst. We don't have Sophocles' bad plays or Aeschylus or even Aristophanes. Like we just have the good ones. But we got lucky with Euripides and we got these ones that people considered bad. And then you have plays in there like the Helen, where we get this fascinating idea that she never went there to begin with, that like a weird ghost Eidolon was there in her place, and meanwhile she's just hanging out in Egypt, and the Menelaus in that play is amazing, and he's like this nice supportive husband who just like wants to do right by her, and like what, like that is so cool. And so yeah, I mean, I just think about if we only have like a little handful of examples of that, like how many were there from countless playwrights and oral storytelling traditions and everybody else. Like, what are all the things we don't have?
Okay, so as a final question though, Liv, I always ask people that come on my channel to leave the viewers with a little piece of advice. Now, obviously you have a podcast which details Greek mythology, so minus that, because that's a given, what is the advice that you would give to people trying to get into Greek mythology?
Don't try to understand chronology. It will only hurt you and make you sad. So just don't worry about it. Accept that chronology doesn't exist. Not least because the god Kronos with a CH also didn't exist by that point. But also, yeah, chronology is a big one. But also, I think that the thing that is hardest to wrap your head around when you're not as deep as you and I are, and I think it's really helpful to think about right from the beginning if you can, is to learn about why and how these stories were created, and to specifically utilize that and sort of ignore our modern ideas of storytelling and narrative structure. Because I think that when you go into Greek mythology wanting modern notions of narrative, you end up really disappointed, because you get things like, but why, why don't we know more about Calypso? Why is Calypso only in the Odyssey? Why is she never mentioned elsewhere? What was her deal? All these different things. You have all these questions. Even Circe is a really good example because she barely features anywhere else. And so, like, you want to have the answers. You want to, like, be like, well, no, like, her character is clearly big. Like, it's the Aeneas of it all, right? It's like us talking about this Greek Aeneas. And so you just have to remember, I think maybe Greek Aeneas doesn't actually count in this because I think there's some lost things. But it's more so that, like, they did not write the stories to tell a straightforward narrative like we would think of now. Nobody sat down and was like, I'm going to build Circe's character development. Like, I'm going to build out her character and make sure she's really like flesh and blood. That was never the point. The point was, the oral storytelling of it all, or when it comes to mythology, the point was to understand the world around, to understand the gods, all these different things where, like, they just weren't out to answer the questions that modern people have. And so you just shouldn't try to have them. Like, you can have them, but, like, just know that you're never going to have an answer. And that in itself is interesting. It doesn't make it disappointing. It makes it interesting that we don't have answers, whether it's because something's lost or because it never existed in the first place. Like, all around, it's just, it adds to the interest, so long as you are not letting yourself be disappointed by, like, a lack of information.
That is such a wonderful piece of advice to end on. So thank you so much, Liv. I honestly appreciate you coming on finally, for taking the time to actually sit down and chat with me, because I know that video is not your favorite thing. And so I do appreciate that you did this, so thank you. And also thank you to everybody who is watching. Thank you guys. Honestly, I appreciate it massively. With all of you guys liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, just viewing the whole video, it means the absolute world to me, because it does help me run this channel. It does help me continue to give you guys access to incredible people like Liv, but also in order to keep running this channel. Now, obviously with Liv, you guys can find all of her links in the description below, as per normal here on the channel. So you can find her Twitter, her Instagram, her podcast, obviously. And you can also find all of the links to her beautiful books. So down there will be affiliate links on Amazon. Hit those if you guys want to order Liv's books, because it means I get a teeny tiny percentage of that purchase. And every little helps, as Tesco likes to say. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.